welcome you today to the webinar on the global economy in a time of a pandemic. First, I hope that you, your family, and your loved ones are all safe and in good health. In November 2019, the world was hit with a perfect storm in the form of a disrupted pandemic that affected people and economies and spread without discrimination throughout the developed world and emerging economies. The pandemic has caused a worldwide shock that affected people's lives and livelihoods and led to a slowdown in economies, disrupted financial markets, disturbed value chains, and caused wild swings in demand. The resulting precautionary health and safety measures, including lockdowns, physical distancing, and the economic implications such as laying off people, pushed millions around the world either to work remotely or be out of work. From an economic perspective, falling oil prices, slowing manufacturing, tumbling stock market indices, and severe hits to businesses forced governments to pass comprehensive and unprecedented fiscal and monetary policy responses aiming at stimulating their economies and preventing mass layoffs and business shutdowns, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises. Later in 2020, we have seen recently what is known as the second wave of cases, leading some countries to once again impose lockdowns, curfews, and other measures to keep their populations safe while trying at the same time to keep their economies functioning. 2020 was a year like no other in recent memory and made the metaphor of wartime economics more relevant because there is no peacetime precedent for the asymmetric mix of mobilization and demobilization of people and resources similar to the one that took place last year. In 2021, we are hopefully seeing some light with the good news that the COVID-19 pandemic can be brought under control if the approved vaccines can be produced in the required quantities and are affordable and universally accessible. On January 22nd, 2021, there was an article in The Economist basically warning of the unequal timely distribution of the vaccines globally and warning that this might prolong the pandemic, the restrictions needed to contain it, and the associated human and economic suffering. What does this mean to the global economy? What should we expect in 2021? Is it going to be a déjà vu 2020? It all depends on how countries will combat and control the pandemic through vaccines, distribution, and other health and safety measures taken. How does the recovery look like? For Egypt, what does it mean as an emerging economy that showed, despite a tough and challenging year, a positive economic growth of 3.6% in 2020? What to expect in 2021? It is projected to be around 2.8%. Is it going to be? And what does it mean to employment? The massive acceleration of digital transformation. Tourism. Many more issues we want to discuss, and we're delighted today to have with us Professor Gita Gopinath. She's the Chief Economist and Director of the Research Department at the International Monetary Fund. Please allow me first to introduce Gita. She's on leave of public service from Harvard University Economics Department, where she is the John Zwaanstra Professor of International Studies and of Economics. Her research, which focuses on international finance and macroeconomics, has been published in many top economics journals. She has authored numerous research articles on exchange rates, trade and investment, international finance crises, monetary policy, debt, and emerging market crises. She is the co-editor of the current Handbook of International Economics and was earlier the co-editor of the American Economic Review, and she's the managing editor of the Review of Economic Studies. She had also previously served as the co-director of the International Finance and Macroeconomics Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research, a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and a member of the Economic Advisory Panel of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. From 2016 to 2018, she was the economic advisor to the Chief Minister of Kerala State in India. She also served as a member of the Eminent Persons Advisory Group on G20 Matters for India's Ministry of Finance. Ms. Gopinath is an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the Econometric Society, and the recipient of the Distinguished Alumnus Award from the University of Washington. In 2019, Foreign policy named her one of the top global thinkers. 2014, she was named one of the top 25 economists under 45 by the IMF. And in 2011, she was chosen as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum. The Indian government awarded her the Pravasi Bharatiya Samman, the highest honor conferred on overseas Indians. Before joining the faculty of Harvard University in 2005, she was an assistant professor of economics at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. Gita was born in India. She is a US citizen and an overseas citizen of India. She received her PhD in economics from Princeton University in 2001 after earning a BA from Lady Shri Ram College and MA degrees from Delhi School of Economics and University of Washington. Now it's also my sincere pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's session, our own Nada Bakri. Nada is originally from Alexandria. She's a graduating senior majoring in economics and minoring in psychology and business administration. She's currently leading the economics department's team of student ambassadors and is a teaching assistant for labor economics and economics of Egypt. Outside the classroom, Nada is a competitive volleyball player and is also part of the university's ultimate Frisbee team. Thank you very much, Gita, for joining us today. We look forward to listening to your insights. And Nada, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Dean Kamel. I'm honored to be moderating the event today, and greetings from Cairo to everyone as the event is streamed on AUC School of Business and the IMF's Facebook pages and Twitter as well. Gita, speaking on behalf of my female business student colleagues, we must say we're very inspired to see the first female chief economist of the IMF. First, we'll be spending the first part of today's webinar by panel questions to Gita, followed by Q&As from the audience. So for Zoom attendees, please type your questions in the Q&A box. And for questions from Facebook participants, please use the comment section. Gita, let me start by saying 2020, as Dr. Sharif just said, was definitely a year like no other. In just 3 months since the release of the IMF's last forecast in October, recorded COVID-19 deaths have doubled to over 2 million. And in these same 3 months, multiple vaccines have seen unexpectedly strong success, and some countries have started ambitious vaccination drives. So now, as the global economy moves into the next phase of the COVID-19 crisis, is 2021 a turning point?
Thank you, Nada. And firstly, I want to thank Dr. Sharif Kamel for introducing me. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to all of you. The AUC School of Business has an extremely good reputation internationally, and this is a real honor to do this. Nada, it's a particular pleasure for me to be interviewed by you and for you to moderate the session. So yes, the question that we all entered 2021 asking was that, is this year going to be different from 2020? I think the answer is yes, it will be different. 2020 was like a year like no other. I believe 2021 will also be a year like no other, but for other reasons, for different reasons. What we are seeing around the world is the fact that we still have the pandemic. Countries are still struggling with dealing with the contagion. We know what we're learning is that there are new variants. Some of these variants are able to evade the vaccine to some extent, not fully, but to some extent. That poses a challenge. So it doesn't look like this will be a one and done situation, that could be the 2021 could be a year where we continue to have the race between vaccines and the virus. There will be booster shots and so on. So the pandemic stays. But again, let's keep in mind that we could have been in a much worse place. There was no guarantee that we would have so many successful vaccines. That's the good news. We have those. So there is a hope that the world might be able to exit this crisis with somewhat less scarring than we would have thought in 2020. But what I do want to emphasize is that countries are recovering, but at very different speeds, different forms of recovery. And there are multiple reasons for it. A lot depends upon how resilient your economy is to being able to function through social distancing. How much of reliance do you have on tourism, on commodity exports? And importantly, how much of policy space do you have? So there are advanced economies that gave about 24% of their GDP in fiscal support. But then emerging and middle income countries did only 6% and low income countries did 2%. So that variation also will show up in the recovery. So again, the headline I would say of 2021 is where, great, we've had unprecedented success with vaccines, but that said, there is still tremendous uncertainty and where, we still have the pandemic we're living with, and we are seeing diverging recoveries across countries.
Thank you, Gita. And on the policy front, what are the specific measures that would support the recovery? And also, given our generation is very much concerned with climate change, can those measures also drive greener and more inclusive growth?
Great question. So in terms of what's needed, the policy response has to be tailored to the phase of the crisis the country is, because there are some countries that have been able to durably bring down the number of cases. So that's at that point, you're doing something different. But I would say that if your country is still subject to lockdowns and containment measures which prevent certain kinds of business activities from happening, prevent people from going to work, then you have to maintain lifelines, targeted lifelines to these people as best possible. Healthcare spending will, of course, remain a priority for 2021, also because of the vaccine rollout. Now, once we get towards the end of this year and we start seeing that we are actually durably able to keep the contagion low, at that time you want to start, encouraging labor to move to sectors that are growing. So you do want to allow for resource reallocation to happen, and that would be the second phase of it. And yes, a point that we've always made is that you want to undertake policies with an eye not just on today and next month, but on the future. And indeed, one of the big challenges we face is climate change. It was there before the crisis. It is a huge existential threat to the planet. And it can be addressed, so it doesn't have to be that way. We put out new work that shows that if you're going to have a synchronized green public investment push by countries that have the fiscal space, that will be good for the planet, but it will also be good in terms of creating jobs. But we're also going to need carbon pricing, which is gradually increasing over time. So combination of policies indeed to make the world move towards a more sustainable economic environment, and also in terms of in terms of inclusiveness. What this crisis has made abundantly clear is the importance of social safety nets, and many countries will need to think of how they have some of this social safety net in an expanded form on a much more prolonged basis.
Thank you. And if then we come to inequality, which I believe is an area of great concern within the circumstances we're facing. So now we know income inequality is worsening both between and within countries. So I'd ask, what is it that's driving that divergence? And is there a way to arrest it?
So we are seeing a lot of, yes, indeed, we're seeing a lot of variation in how countries are dealing with the pandemic and recovering from it. So firstly, the severity of the pandemic has varied across countries. Some places have been harder hit than others. And accordingly, the public health responses have been different. Some have used much more stricter containment measures, while others have not. And we've seen that has had differential impact on economic activity. An important piece is just your sectoral composition. So if you are a country that relies very heavily on contact intensive activities and sectors that are like hospitality, restaurants, tourism, then you are being harder hit because there's really not an easy substitute for it. But on the other hand, if you're a country that relies a lot more on technology sectors, where remote working works extremely well, financial services, for instance, too, all of that, those economies are being more resilient. And I have to say that, though we had a second wave around the world that in terms of numbers was much worse than the first wave, in terms of the hit to economic activity, that has been smaller, significantly smaller than what we saw during the first wave, which tells you that the world has adapted some to living with social distancing and living with the virus. Now, another set of factors are in terms of, again, the policy support that was provided. But let me just jump to the question of how do we prevent further divergence? So in terms of preventing the divergence, I would say first and foremost is to make sure that the pandemic ends everywhere as fast as feasible. Right now, unfortunately, we are in a very divided situation. We have many advanced economies and some emerging and developing economies that have sufficient access to vaccines. They have their own home production. But there are many, many more countries that do not have access to vaccinations and are unlikely to get there until next year, and even for some, even beyond. And that is one big cause for divergence. And that everything has to be done to address that. That will require, of course, greater financing for making sure countries get the doses they need, but also for paying for logistics. But financing alone may not be enough, because production can be a very important constraint, and we're seeing that human capital in terms of producing these vaccines is a constraint. So there has to be some thought going into how do you ensure that you constantly have enough production, and especially if you're going to need more updated vaccines to deal with the virus. So that's one big area on the health front where much more needs to be done to avert the divergence. A second big area, of course, is that countries in the meantime have to continue to support their population at the minimum through health care spending and through, say, cash transfers to the poor, depending again on the amount of lockdown, amount of containment that you're having. Now, again, the advanced economies, they're able to do that much more easily, even though they did a whole lot more, like I said earlier, in 2020, they are much less constrained, while many developing countries are feeling the pressure of needing to tighten their policies at this point because of the fact that they're more constrained, even though they didn't do as much the last time. It's just given the fiscal space that they have. So here, it's important, I would say it's very important here to maintain stable financial conditions. The reason I say that is because the easing of monetary policy by the major central banks around the world had the positive effect of making borrowing costs quite low for many emerging markets, which enable them to do whatever spending that they did. And so that's, but we're entering 2021 in this tricky situation, which is one, we have these diverging recoveries. You have to worry about whether, you worry about building up of financial risks. We are worried about complacency in financial markets, about overvalued assets. Any turmoil over there will hit emerging and developing economies. If there is any statement made by a major central bank official about what's going to happen with monetary policy that's different from what was expected, you can get, again, turmoil in markets, and that can be a problem. And then the third issue, so that would also be very important to prevent divergence. And a third set is with respect to countries that already entered this crisis with very high levels of debt and aren't able to access markets at any kind of reasonable rates. So in the international community, and that's what we've been doing at the IMF with many other institutions, is to make sure there's concessional financing available. You have aid, you have grants. And in some cases where the debt is unsustainable is that you just have debt restructuring. Maybe that's the only solution. And then I would make one last point, which is to make sure that, again, you don't end up with great divergence, is we are going to be in a future where you have much more reliance on the digital economy, much more important to make sure that your economy is climate resilient. All of this requires investments in digital infrastructure and climate mitigation adaptation. Again, some countries have the resources, others don't. We have to make sure that developing countries are able to do the right amounts of investment to attain the sustainable development goals, so that, again, we continue to see convergence in prospects across countries in the world.
Thank you. And going back to how you said there are countries that are more dependent on service sectors, and actually like a country like Egypt, which is very dependent on the tourism sector for maintaining a healthy external balance. Do you think the shock was a signal to these countries to diversify?
It is indeed always very helpful if you have a diversified economy so that you can be more resilient to shocks of this kind. If you look at Egypt's numbers, I mean, Egypt does rely on tourism, but at the same time, it has actually managed this crisis better than many other countries that, who've been hit much harder. Now, there are many reasons for it, but again, indeed, I think there is the argument to be made. And like I said, the digital economy is going to be a very important part of the future. And that's one area where lots of countries would benefit from investing in.
And we saw how the digital sector has been big, if not the biggest winner during the crisis.
I'm sorry, Nada, I couldn't hear you.
How do you think countries can
I couldn't hear you for about 10 seconds.
Okay, sorry about that. I was just saying that the digital sector has been big, if not the biggest winner during the crisis. And the pandemic highlighted the need to accelerate digital transformation. So how do you think countries can prioritize digital spending in the recovery? And what impact might that have?
Indeed, first of all, countries that had in place good digital infrastructure were able to much more quickly move to work from home. They also were able to provide, social assistance to their households and also to their firms much more easy because, digital methods of making transfers and payments are just so much superior to other forms of it. So clearly, everybody needs to, but we still have a large fraction of the world that doesn't have access to the internet. So this is again something that investment will be needed. Of course, there is, this will require raising money for many countries. Financing and external financing would be one channel to make that happen. Private investment is an important way that you can bring that about too. But also, it is a development need. And so you could make a case also for obviously development financing from certain institutions to help make this kind of investment. But it is an important priority should be an important priority for countries.
Definitely. And so given that new reality, and if countries do have this as a priority, the digital economy, how do you think that new reality will affect women's participation in the labor market, especially given that it's now easier for them to strike the balance between their work and like parenting duties? So will their participation be affected in any way?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a very important question about what's happened. Also, I want to just comment very quickly on what happened with the impact on women in this crisis. So usually when you have a recession, it's the manufacturing sector that gets hit much harder than services. But this time around, because of the particular peculiarities of this crisis, which required the restrictions and lockdowns, you had the services sector that's been hit much worse than manufacturing. Now, manufacturing is where you have a greater share of men, services where you have a greater share of women. And so women have been harder hit in this crisis as opposed to in previous crisis situations. So that is indeed, first of all, going to be a challenge to make sure that as the economies recover, to make sure that women are, come back into the workforce. Also, women are still very much more responsible for childcare than men are. And so with schools shut down in many parts of the world, it was the women who stayed home and were taking care of the children. So again, they've been harder hit. It's important to make sure that once we have the recoveries, also strong recoveries, that recovery comes along with women coming back to work. Now, to the question of, in general, what the future would look like, I think that to the extent that there is the flexibility of work from home, I believe that it will make work more attractive and much more, doable for women too. So I think that is a favorable outcome. Now, at the same time, what this crisis is also accelerating is a shift to greater automation. Some of the work we've done shows that women are going to be more hit by increases in automation, given the kinds of jobs they do. And so again, I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed, but I think that's a major concern. So even if we bring back a lot of the jobs, what I am concerned about is that we will have the shift to greater automation. It's what has come about. It's been what happened over the last decade. But we've seen that has given rise to an increase in inequality. And there are no simple solutions for how to deal with it. But the emphasis on greater skill training in terms of adapting to the new kinds of economy, new kinds of jobs, all of that, which we've always known is a priority, just needs to get a lot more emphasis now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Gita, for your outlook. I think it's time we take questions from the audience. And thank you for taking the time to share your insight. I'll start with, we have a question. So is the excessive fiscal and monetary policy stimulus going to lead to asset bubble as financial markets are disconnected from real economy, as stock markets performing, but unemployment is high?
So, this was a crisis that needed very aggressive action from both fiscal authorities and monetary authorities. And we saw that, especially in the advanced economies. We saw very large cuts in interest rates, asset purchases, and so on. So we did have very aggressive policy. Now, an outcome of that is that you've seen asset prices be kind of almost exuberant, right? And so I think asset markets are quite reliant on the best case scenario for the pandemic, which is that if we have the vaccines, things will only get better, and we will have strong recoveries in the second half of this year. And at the same time, interest rates will stay very low for a long time. So under those set of assumptions, the markets are where they are. Now, in our opinion, we do believe that there are stretched asset valuations, that there is overvaluations in risky assets. We are worried about complacency in financial markets, that somehow there will always be this policy interventions that are needed to keep stock prices up. And so we are flagging that. It's a difficult, I think everybody, even policymakers around the world, are concerned about it, but of course it's a difficult trade-off, because you still are the economies still haven't fully recovered, so you want to keep in place accommodative policies. But we are, putting a lot of emphasis on saying that whatever measures can be taken for ensuring that you don't have further buildup in these kind of financial risks is absolutely important, even at this time. So this is indeed the question is to use all the tools at your disposal so that you can make sure that while you keep interest rates low and you keep them accommodative, at the same time you are not letting all kinds of financial risks build up in the system. Because if anything goes wrong there, while it's a problem for advanced economies, but there will be very large spillovers to emerging developing economies too. So that's an important, an important risk.
Thank you. And then we have a second question that says, a larger section of the world is moving towards automation. In this situation, how are the unskilled or newly entrants in the labor force be dealt with?
Yeah, this is actually a big challenge. And we know that the last decade or more of automation was one of the factors for the increase in inequality that we saw in many countries. Now, in general, the view is that greater automation, greater technological developments on net add jobs, raise productivity. Now, I would say that over the last decade or so, the kind of technological developments that have happened, it's not clear, that there are mixed results. We haven't certainly seen a big increase in productivity, despite all the increase in automation. So I think the results are mixed. The question is, what is needed? The obvious solutions are, of course, to ensure that, of course, there's much more schooling that happens, there's much more development of human capital, that there's appropriate skilling. and in the transition when people are losing jobs, that you have social safety nets, that you provide unemployment insurance, you pay basic incomes. I mean, all of those are there. But the truth is that this is easier said than done. And so one will have to be a lot more creative on how you deal with this issue going forward in terms of making sure there's greater skilling. I think there has to be a rethink of what policies are needed. There's also a point that's been made about, in the past, the assumption was that, well, workers will always move to wherever the best jobs are available. And we know from the last 20 years of evidence that that doesn't really happen that easily, at least in some parts of the world. And so more, you might need place-based interventions to make sure that the individuals, parts of the country have good infrastructure and so on, good schools. Good access to opportunity everywhere. So all of that will be needed. But again, like I said, frankly speaking, I'd say one of the big challenges, medium-term, long-term challenges, is exactly how you're going to deal with greater automation and the risks that might have on people who will not overnight have the skills that are needed for it.
Thank you. And then we have another question. Will we see in the aftermath of the corona crisis an economic growth like in the EU and the USA after the Second World War, and on an international stage, including Africa and the MENA region?
This year, and you can see that from our numbers, just because there is, the fact that we shut down activity in 2020, and that led to a collapse. And then you had the reopening that led to recoveries. Now, of course, it will still take some time, and we're not fully back there yet. But 2021 was a year where you will mechanically see some very eye-popping numbers on pretty much any variable you want to pick, because 2020 was so different from any other year. So we have global growth projected to be 5.5% in 2021. It's been a long time since global growth was at anywhere close to that level. But that's again just coming back from the bounce back. And it is the case that the policy measures that have been taken have been quite unprecedented. Debt around the world, both public and private debt, is at record highs. We have global public sector debt, which is actually slightly higher than what we had post World War II in the world. So, like I said, the numbers in terms of fiscal stimulus are just quite substantial. Now, of course, that has positive spillovers to the world. I mean, when you just have the US, and if you have the Euro area and Japan all growing faster, and China growing faster, that's going to, just through trade channels, through capital flows, through investment, you're going to see a positive spillover to the rest of the world, and that's going to show up in their growth numbers too. So I think that what we would absolutely like to see is these kinds of very strong growth numbers and strong recovery. Of course, what we have to be careful of is that the business is not done yet, which means that at some point governments will be thinking about how to remove these exceptional policy measures that they have put in place. Which includes things like the moratoria that were put on people paying their loans, mortgages, and so on. So we have to see how the world reacts to that at that point in time when these policy measures, exceptional policy measures, are removed. I know there are concerns about inflation and so on. So everybody has to kind of pay very close attention to the recovery. We like the growth story, but of course you want to make sure that that is sustainable and doesn't show up in any kind of overheating or anything of that kind.
Perfect. And then we go back to digitalization again. So there's a question that says, digitalization obviously has the potential to either increase social and income inequalities or help decrease the gaps. In light of the rapid digitalization due to the pandemic, do you believe that the governments can keep up with this pace and kind of regulate the social consequences of digitalization?
Well, I mean, this is, what we have certainly seen is that countries that could, that had a digital infrastructure, firstly, that helped with remote schooling. I think that was an important thing that also helped with work from home. with making social transfers available directly. So all of that, I think, has been a blessing for countries, and I think it's been an inclusive blessing. So I think that has been very, very valuable. This is, in my opinion, digital infrastructure is a bit of a low-hanging fruit for countries where you still don't have enough internet penetration. In this crisis, we actually saw governments in some countries provide vouchers to make internet services more accessible to larger numbers of people. So I think, I would say that overall, in terms of digital infrastructure, this certainly helps with inclusivity in terms of getting people access to it, helps with your education, helps with building skills. So I think I see many positives to it.
Yes, thank you. And then we have a question that says, where do you think the pandemic leaves the ability of monetary policy in combating the adverse effects of the pandemic? And is monetary policy now completely observed? And are central banks out of ammunition?
So in dealing with this pandemic, the way policies worked, and typically in the past, the recessions, you would say what policies do is stimulate the economy, which is there is a sense in which, for some reason, people are very hesitant to spend, either because there are high risks, and you lower interest rates, for instance, or you give them tax cuts to encourage them to go out and and spend and consume and invest. Now, this time around, it was very different. This time, we were actually telling people to stay home. We were telling people to not go to work and not go and spend, and factories to shut down. But still, a lot of policy was, support was provided. But so this was a case where we were trying to support the economy. So what you were trying to do was to say, we want to keep the framework, the fabric of the economy in place, so that when you reopen and when we are past the pandemic, people will return very quickly back to jobs and work and to consumption and investment. You don't want a situation where people lose so much of their income in the midst of the crisis, and factories and businesses shut down so much because people aren't showing up to work. When you have these when you're trying to prevent yourself from getting infected. That when you open up, there's not that recovery. So that's the way. And so in case of monetary policy, interest rate cuts, asset purchases that they did, I think the big role they played initially was mostly to prevent turmoil in financial markets, kind of excessive disruptions in markets, and which we did see happen in March and April, which was all kinds of breakdowns in financial markets. And a lot of the intervention was basically to prevent, to stop that from happening. And that's the way it worked. To your question of whether monetary authorities have run out of ammunition, what is absolutely true is that in terms of just a simple interest rate, we have about, the 96% of advanced economies have interest rates below 1%. That's the last number I had. So everybody is very close to the zero lower bound. Now you can go somewhat negative, but you can't, there are trade-offs and you can't go too negative. So a lot is dependent on the asset purchase channel, but there's only that much that asset purchases can do. They're certainly a more blunt instrument than interest rates are. So indeed, I would say that while they've not, in theory, out of exhausted their tools, but they can still do more forward guidance. There's many more things that one can happen. But let's hope that we're now in a situation where we don't need much more on the monetary policy front, and actually we can start seeing the recovery, in which case over time things will adjust back to normal.
Yes, let's hope that. And another question says, the pandemic has hit the irregular workers the most and has caused disturbances to labor markets around the world. In the case of the informal economy and informal workers, what do you think governments should do to take advantage and provide the proper motivations for these workers to formalize?
So yes, I think this is again a very unique feature of this crisis, which is that in the past, the informal sector was a shock absorber, which is what it meant was that usually most of the hit to activity happened in the formal sector, and you had the you had people who were losing jobs in the formal sector moving to the informal sector. So the informal sector was a bit of the safety net. But this time around, because of the nature of the crisis, the informal sector was also hit very very badly, and that is is indeed a huge problem. But now, in terms of, firstly, what that has meant is that governments had to be very creative in making sure that they could get cash transfers in the hand of informal workers, and you saw that happen. Again, digital infrastructure helped over there. But in terms of what will it take to make sure that they get back their jobs and they actually get back their livelihoods, I think a lot basically depends on the recovery in the economy. You see that you have general health and recovery in the economy and starts coming back, and people go around and are spending. You actually start seeing this return in jobs and in terms of workers everywhere, and that will be true for the informal sector too. But yes, what we do know is that the informal sector in general, productivity tends to be lower. Social protection also is lower when you work in the informal sector, and policies that can be put in place to encourage people getting more formalized would help both in terms of raising productivity and also in terms of making sure that people are, get the insurance that they need and they get the right amount of social protection that they need.
Thank you. And then we have what type of policies can underdeveloped countries, especially the ones under conflict, take to help them recover their economies?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Yeah, what type of policies can underdeveloped countries, especially the ones under conflict, take to help them recover their economies?
Of course, when those are countries with multiple challenges, and the first priority, I think if for any country, the absolute basic priority has to be healthcare spending and making sure that the poor are not getting poorer, and making sure that there are cash transfers. So those are the two pieces of it. But indeed, I mean, it is the other kinds of challenges that you have when you already have conflict in your country. Of course, that poses a separate challenge. That won't be addressed just with this, and it's not going to be addressed even during this pandemic. But again, for a lot of countries, what you have to still do is, I would say, the number one threat at this point for most economies is the COVID crisis. Again, making sure that you have the right amount of health spending, right amount of protection for the poor, so that you don't have social unrest. I think those are very important. And here I believe it's very important for the international community to provide a helping hand and to play an important role.
Definitely. Gita, we're getting lots of questions. So the next one says, do you know of any upcoming policy that helps workers adapt to changing work industries, such as job training? And what jobs are the highest risk of being automated? And what industries are thriving or will thrive post-COVID?
So, what the evidence, of course, shows you that it's the more mechanical kinds of jobs, the jobs that are, that can happen much more mechanically. Those are the kinds of jobs which don't involve a very creative component, that don't involve, human presence. That those are the ones that are going to be be affected in the automation process. But on the other hand, sectors that require a human touch, even hospitality, of course, has a huge human aspect to it, and that those are the ones that will survive. Or if you have if you're doing a research job with a high amount of creativity, those kinds of jobs are more likely to survive. So again, so that is kind of that's the spectrum along with which you're thinking about the kinds of jobs that will survive. But anything that requires a great deal of creativity, anything that requires personal human touch will survive better than the other ones, which are which are much more kind of mechanical, more you can automate them much more easily. Things which involve you entering into a spreadsheet or doing certain calculations that our computers can do, scheduling appointments and so on, which you can do much more easily. All of those kinds of jobs are much more affected. So At the IMF, we are thinking hard about this future of work and of jobs, and indeed, ensuring, again, high levels of education, ensuring skilling, training, all of these are kind of some of the basic steps that will be needed to make sure that people can transition to jobs which have where there's less automation happening. I will also add that the point of how much of automation you have is also something that public policy can have an effect on. And so that is the very important question of, do you want to, what's the right amount of automation that you're going to have in your country? I don't have any very big thoughts on it, but this is something that one has to keep in mind, that there's nothing inevitable about this.
Yes. And then we have one more IMF specific question. It says, what is the IMF doing to dilute the damages happening in developing countries?
So again, so this has been, like I said, this has been a challenge for the world, and this is exactly where the role the IMF was built for. So we, in 2020, we, provided financing to, if I'm getting my last count right, I think about 83 or 85 countries around the world. Most of them were in the form of emergency financing programs to developing countries, but also to make sure that they were able to maintain basic livelihoods, that they were able to save lives, and we moved much more quickly. I mean, these were, by the way, record numbers that the IMF accomplished in terms of the number of countries that were being helped in 2020, and we obviously continue to do that, and we stand ready to do more. We've provided debt relief to our poorest members who have been borrowers from the IMF. And we provide kind of facilities so that if you are going to be a country that's going to face a big foreign exchange reserve problem, that you can have access to prudential tools from the IMF. So there's a lot that's being done by us, but also by the World Bank and other institutions around the world. But again, from our perspective, this crisis is certainly not over. We still have many countries that are struggling with being able to maintain basic levels of spending in a very difficult time. We will have countries that exit this crisis with high levels of debt, and several of them should be unsustainable. And indeed, the setback to their sustainable development, achieving the sustainable development goals, is a very important factor. It's, that's usually the role of the World Bank, and that is important. But at the IMF, we also have facilities to provide concessional lending to poorer nations, which is something that we have also expanded on in this crisis.
Thank you. And again, on sustainability, a question says, in your opinion, to what extent will the IMF reform program in Egypt help positively enhance industrialization and sustainable development in the next decade?
So, Egypt has made a lot of progress. We had the program that was there from between 2016 and 2019, at a time when there was a real risk of a serious financial crisis in Egypt. And the program was very successful in preventing much worse outcomes, in bringing back, fiscal stability, in building up of foreign exchange reserves, and just having a much stronger macro environment, which I believe was one important factor to allow Egypt to do the kinds of measures it could do in this crisis and prevent a much bigger hit to the economy. We have now a standby arrangement with Egypt, which continues to have some of the features of the EFF that we had before. But again, I think the bottom line in all of these programs that we've had are a few things. One is to increase the role of the private sector, emphasis on improving governance, emphasis on increasing inclusivity, making sure there's a strong social safety net. So I would say these are some of the three big features of what is needed going forward. But and that would continue to put Egypt on a strong footing macroeconomically, but also to have kind of sustainable inclusive growth.
Thank you, Gita. We have lots of questions, but we already went over time, unfortunately. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your outlook. And Dr. Sharif, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Nada. Thank you so much. And Gita, you've covered a lot of ground. And I'm sure this was extremely insightful and informative to many of our participants today. Let me just, in just 2 minutes, wrap up some of the highlights of what you said. And surely I won't be able to cover all the things that you've covered. Well, in short, pandemic is here to stay for hopefully for the short term. And hopefully the vaccine distribution is not going to be, in my view, the diplomacy associated with it and the nationalism aspect is associated with it is not going to overrule. And we can, as we move forward, the shorter the period the vaccine distribution is going to take place, the faster the recovery is going to happen. But hey, we've gone through a lot over the past year, and we expect some of it during this year. And there will no one size that fits all. That will not happen. Countries will suffer differently and will overcome those challenges differently. But one important element you've covered is diversification is extremely important, making actually the distinction between service and manufacturing economies. And I think on that note, maybe Egypt has a bit of a plus here, given the diversified nature of its economy. I believe the whole world, developed and developing, is learning on the go. And the message is how flexible, how responsive, how adaptive they become, and how creative they become. I think the new norm, as it's being dubbed, is going to be easier. Where, as you rightly pointed out, digital transformation is here to stay, and that will affect so many jobs. Requiring investments, and not just in health, which is extremely important, but also in human capital. You've touched also upon the future of learning and the future of work. I think the notion of upskilling and reskilling, because some jobs will be lost, but also some jobs will be created. And I always say that we always look for people that will be able to deal with machines rather than machines was going to be replacing people. The skill set required is definitely is here to stay, but the new skill set as we move forward. On a more positive note, as you rightly said, the 5.5% global growth rate expected, at least globally, with some of the developed economies having a bit of a spillover to the rest of the world, help them to recover. Obviously, the associated policies that are going to take place while focusing on healthy spending and digital divide can also have its negative implication with the poorer getting poorer. So addressing that sort of gap and that trade-off is definitely should be on the top of the priorities. Last but not least, I think the IMF program with Egypt was extremely successful during the period 16-19, and today with the stand-by arrangement that is taking place, I think will push Egypt for what I actually call Reform 2.0, where hopefully the unleashed potential of the private sector is actually takes place, but also zooming in on the issues that impedes investments, including red tape and bureaucracy and the like, and surely governance also takes an important element in that. So this is not all what you've covered, but this is just snapshots of what you've covered. As Nada pointed out at the beginning, this was aired to our students, but also live on different media channels. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to, again, hosting you in future events at AUC School of Business. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sharif Kamal, and thank you, Nada. This was really a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I hope I can come in person. I've never traveled to Egypt. I would like to.
Look forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.